Hi, everyone out there. Welcome to the third global dialogue on food system resilience, organized by the FACT Alliance, the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, in short, FACT Alliance, hosted by MIT. My name is Michael Hauser. I'm an associate professor at BOKU University and a senior associate with CIFOR-ICRAF in Kenya, and I'm calling in from Nairobi. Now, this third seminar is about food trade and how to build supply chain resilience amid all the shocks we are currently experiencing. You may ask, why is that important? Why does it matter? Well, most likely, most of us on this webinar depend on food trade, on food that is traded, and we shouldn't take this trade for granted. As the environment changes, so does food trade. Well, for those in East Africa, you may still remember the darkening skies of locust all over us. In 2020, East Africa experienced its worst locust invasion in decades, and this crisis hampered not only production, but also disrupted local food markets and trade. Then, following the war in Europe, trade-related policies imposed by countries have surged. As of November 2023, 19 countries have implemented food export bans, with 9 others implementing export limiting measures. So this is something we're gonna talk about. India, for example, banned the export of non-basmati white rice in July. This was to tame surging domestic food prices and ensure adequate domestic availability. Well, in the meantime, a couple of days ago, India has lifted that ban on export of rice to a few countries, to Kenya and 4 other African countries. But nevertheless, several of these factors contribute also to food inflation. At the moment, 7.5% here in Kenya, but it was much higher last October, above 15% for a short period in time. Obviously, food insecurity is one of the consequences of all that, and in 2023, over 200 million people globally are facing emergency and famine conditions. So we have to ask if risks related to food trade have increased, and we also need to better understand what the biggest vulnerabilities are that require urgent attention, and how can all relevant actors converge interests, needs, and actions to make food trade not a risk, but a risk buffering instrument. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague Greg Sixt at the Abdul Latif Jamil Water and Food Systems Lab at MIT. He's calling in from Cambridge. Greg is also the director of the FACT Alliance, and he will introduce to you the panel. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining. Excited to be here with you today on our third FACT Alliance Global Dialogue. Just a brief background for those of you who are joining us for the first time. The FACT Alliance is based at MIT's J-WAFS lab, the Jamil Water and Food Systems Lab, and we're J-WAFS leads FACT. It's a global network of over 20 institutions focused on food systems convergence research, so integrating across academic disciplines and research disciplines, and engaging stakeholders as partners in the research process to find solutions to vexing climate and food systems challenges. I'm quite pleased today to have a really distinguished panel with us. Ken Strzepek from my colleague at MIT here, Lucie Smith from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Lydia Kimani from Agribusiness for African Markets, Cedric Pene from the World Trade Organization, and my colleague Immaculate Adele is with us as well, helping to run this webinar. So I'm gonna dive right in. I'm gonna ask an overarching question and ask each of the panelists to provide a short response of about a minute. One thing I want to frame for the conversation today is just a reminder that food trade is an important component of food security, but it is not a measure of food security. There are 6 pillars of food security, and food trade kind of directly touches on some of them. I just want to give that framing, but I'm going to dive in now. So I want to ask the panel, and then I'll call on each of you after I ask it. You know, in your opinion, what do you see as the biggest vulnerabilities in the global food trade system, and what vulnerabilities do you see on the horizon? So I'm going to start. Lucie, do you mind if I go with you first?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, hello to everyone. So just a really quick introduction. I know you introduced me, but my name is Lucie Smith. As Greg said, I work for WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where I look after a sectoral platform, which is called the Soft Commodities Forum, and which brings together 6 agricultural commodity trading firms in order to address the risk of soy-driven deforestation and native vegetation conversion in their soy supply chains. So to your question about the vulnerabilities of our food system, I think that what's clear is that it's going to prove increasingly challenging to feed the world while staying in line with a 1.5 pathway and while staying in line and within planetary boundaries, right? So the equation really becomes, how do we reduce the environmental impact of our food system, which we know is a big emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but also contributes to nature loss through agricultural expansion, through deforestation, as well as freshwater depletion. So how do we reduce its environmental impact while promoting food security and nutrition? You raised this, Greg. There's still hundreds of millions of people who do not have access to healthy and nutritious food. And how do we use the food system in order to generate equitable livelihoods and alleviate poverty? Because we know that a disproportionate portion of people who are in a situation of extreme poverty are actually farmers and food producers. So there's this sort of triple challenge that we're now having to answer to, with the temptation of dipping into some trade-offs and some sort of easy fixes, like promoting increased fertilizer use, which, yes, can boost yields and boost productivity, but also has the capacity to degrade soils and harm soil health. It's also tempting to clear land in order to have larger productive areas, but contributing to, as I said earlier, the conversion of native vegetation and thereby nature loss. So I think that sort of, that equation is going to prove increasingly hard to solve. So I would say that that's the main vulnerability of our food system.
Okay, thank you. Ken, I'm going to go to you. Ken and I are actually working specifically on the Jamil Index for Food Trade and Vulnerability. So, so we're living and breathing these. What are these vulnerabilities right now? So, Ken, I'm gonna send the question to you.
Great. I would say that we have a wide variety of approaches here, but I'm going to focus on the natural climate system. And the biggest threat is trade is talking about supply, demand, and balance. And in some ways, there has been a quasi-balance of that around the globe, as areas that have surplus have traded that to areas with deficit. But what we're seeing now is the starts of climate change in greatly increasing climate variability. And under that, we're seeing places that are normally suppliers having shortages in their supply, and then people that weren't demanding now demanding food imports because they're having a shortage of supply. So in the short term, these extreme events that we're seeing, droughts and floods, are hitting supply, also hitting demands for others. So I see that the issue, and it's only going to get worse as we move forward with climate change. So for me, it's that, and how do we respond to that, and this great uncertainty in what it's going to be. So moving forward in the dark is part of our problem here.
Right, and Ken, just to kind of build off that, just, you know, you and I talk a lot about how our global food trade system is kind of built on averages, right? We've got this system where if one export supplier has a bad year, historically we've been able to have the other suppliers kind of fill that gap. With climate change, we're approaching a point where multiple suppliers can have non-average years, and that kind of throws the whole system in the loop. So Thank you both, Lucie and Ken. Lydia, I'm going to go to you again. Kind of your opinion on what you see the biggest vulnerabilities in the global food trade system, and kind of what do you see on the horizon in terms of how food trade could. What do you see as the biggest vulnerabilities for food trade in the horizon as it relates to what you do? So Lydia, that question goes to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg, and good evening, colleagues. I'm Lydia and I'm calling in from Kenya. And one of the biggest vulnerabilities to food trade is the changing regulatory landscape, especially as countries move to implement their nationally determined contributions. So we are already looking at the implementation of the carbon border adjustment measures. Remember that over time, we have seen the reduction of tariffs in global trade, but there's a reintroduction of tariffs that are of an environmental nature. So you find that this is likely to, in fact, it was Adesina last week who said that Africa is looking at losing close to $25 billion in terms of, as they try to comply to this kind of adjustment measures. And then you find that it's a dilemma because for developing countries, it also presents an opportunity to raise revenue, and they're also in debt distress. So it's a catch-22 situation where they need to resuscitate the economies, but then again, in their trading partners, it presents a higher cost of production in areas where already they're experiencing very high production costs. Again, we're also looking at if the situation escalates, and especially looking at the continued loss and damage that the developing countries have continued to experience. In Kenya last year, we lost 2.5 million head of cattle as a result of the prolonged drought. So you find that our trade in livestock products in the UAE is significantly impacted. And if this persists, then we are looking at even an escalation of climate-related conflicts. So we have to start thinking, how do we address these kinds of challenges going forward? And then also, finally, we are looking at if this persists for countries like my country, where agriculture is predominantly, labor is by women, and then we have new technologies coming in to address climate issues. For example, use of blockchain in carbon emissions, and where we have literacy levels that are very low. So you find that there is a divide that is going to be created, and we will leave a significant number of people behind, even as we adopt new technologies to address climate change issues with regard to food trade. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. So one of the things you're saying is that the way in which the food system and production system, especially, is changing, is changing the dynamics of food trade and kind of who might be involved in that future system. Is that kind of what I'm hearing? Okay. We're going to come back to all this. This is great because we're already getting different angles. Each of you are contributing a different angle. This is great. And Cedric, last but certainly not least, your views on this as a starting point.
Well, thanks a lot, Greg. And first, happy to be with you, all of you. I would agree with all the comments made previously. From my perspective, I would say that one of the great challenge is that we have increased uncertainty by all means. So basically, vulnerabilities, the question is the unknown, which if we look at previous periods, and I have in front of me the FAO Food Price Index, since the late 80s until the beginning of 2000s, we were kind of just low prices, rather kind of oversupply, etc. The situation was not that easy. We had big problems, including on trade-related issues, but they were kind of well identified. If you look now what happened since the early 2000s and even more recently, the only thing we know is extremely difficult to predict what is in front of us. Who could have thought about COVID? Who could have imagined the current geopolitical tensions that we have would all impact seriously the trade system? The other point I think which is important is also the complexity of the challenges and huge challenges, because effectively, as was said, we have to take into account different dimensions. Social, environmental, obviously, food security as part of it. The food and trade system is also highly connected with other systems. The obvious one is energy, but you cannot look at food and trade kind of just in isolation from the rest. So all this to say that we are facing huge challenges. And I think the key element for us is to ensure and preserve a trading system that works as it should be and continue to be as much as possible part of the solution to address this problem, which means resilience, which means kind of that can also very quickly adjust. And I must say, and just to finish with that, the experience of the last couple of years show that during the COVID-19 crisis and more recent, crisis in the Black Sea region, the trade finally has succeeded in being pretty resilient so far. And this is probably also something which is a positive sign. That's all my side for the moment. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I think this is a really good starting point. Again, you're all coming at this from different angles, so I'm looking forward to this. And just one other thing too is that in this first part, we're kind of focusing on the challenges, and then we will actually talk about some solutions and some opportunities. So, Michael, I'm gonna open it up to you to ask if you have any follow-up questions to the panelists.
Well, yes. Well, listening to Cedric, Lucie, Lydia, and Kenneth, I'm wondering to what extent some of the vulnerabilities we're currently facing are actually path dependencies, historically grown inequalities that that we need to tackle. And if these are some of those, are we tackling them sufficiently well? Whoever wants to respond to that. In other words, are we learning fast enough? Cedric, you mentioned, yes, the food system has shown some degree of resilience despite the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal. But are we learning fast enough, also from historical inequalities, and are we changing those fast enough?
Is the question addressed to me?
No, I'm
happy to start, at least from my perspective, from what we see. As you are probably well aware, in the WTO, food security and how to have, trading system evolve is key in the negotiation. We are just in the middle of a meeting at the moment at the level of chaired by the Director General. And agriculture is very much the core of the discussions in the WTO on how can the whole multilateral trading system, food trading system may evolve. And it is clear that there are divergences of views on how to do it. So in a nutshell, and I hope I respond to your question, all members and all countries agree on the need to address food security and also address long-term, short-term and long-term challenges related to climate change. But I think that there are obviously different positions, different situations, and that lead to different options into what action should be taken. And in our case, it has to be agreed by consensus, which means that's pretty difficult to get to a consensus in a situation where you have so much uncertainty and again, so many differences to address around the table. So probably our system is trying to address these issues, but it's still working hard in order to try to define solutions where all members would agree to go in the same direction. I can be more detailed in future discussion.
No.
Thanks.
No, perfect. Well, I would argue that finding an agreement and a common vision is already very good, but then the proof of the pudding is the action actually. Yeah. So I've seen Kenneth's hand up. We can move in that role, Kenneth, and then Lydia. I would like to ask you. How do you see this from a Kenyan perspective? Are we adapting sufficiently well and fast enough?
So one of the things in adapting is there's two things that we look at, both economically and then globally. Is for too long we have been responding to the food security issue in disaster relief. We wait until we have droughts or floods and we have these great demands, and we haven't built the resilience in the demand side to not have this great demand. Then as we look to a long-term stability as climate is changing, we haven't seen that. We have to develop the economy because trade is through money. So if you are importing something, you have to export something. And so we've seen this recently in Ethiopia and other places like we've seen with Kenya. If they are not exporting their cattle, what are they going to use to buy grain for that? So we have to look at this systemically and comprehensively within the entire sustainable development issue. And to what Lucie said, at many times, some of this resilience in food is at the expense of the environment. And we have to understand that balance and how to work with that. For example, building a reservoir gives you storage of water to go through droughts and floods, but it also harms the environment and people's livelihoods and others. So looking at that and learning from that and not being monolithic and going, no dams, all dams. How do we deal with this in a case-by-case basis?
Thanks, Lydia. And then we hand back to Greg. I don't see Lucie, but yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay. I think from a Kenyan perspective, we have had a quick succession of several issues. From a colonial legacy, we had the structural adjustment programs, then we had trade liberalization, and now we find ourselves here. So you find that each of those dispensations has had an impact on especially the development and the thriving ability of the food trade in our country, both domestic and export. So over time, there have been structural underlying issues that have really compromised the ability of food trade to give the return on investment, especially to the smallholder farmers. And of course, now with climate change coming in, it compounds the situation. But one of the things I'd like to really compliment my country is that we are now looking at pursuing both climate and development objectives. And this is going to be very critical for a sector like agriculture, where it is one of the most underfunded sectors in our country, most vulnerable to the economy, also a key contributor to GDP. So the development of the policy and regulatory framework from a climate change perspective now prepares the country to attract climate finance. So to both address development and climate objectives. So that in itself is going to be very phenomenal in turning around the situation, because when you look at our situation, for us, adaptation is what is really key. That is building resilience of incomes and also ecosystems. So as we do this through access to climate finance, sectors like agriculture that have been prioritized in the National Climate Change Action Plan definitely stand a winning chance. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. Lucie, before I hand over to you, colleagues out there in the auditorium, please use the question and answer chat box to make your statements or ask questions. Immaculate already invited you to do so. Now, Lucie, are we moving fast enough in your perspective?
I was gonna build on the point made about timeframes and competing timeframes for the vulnerabilities that we've listed, and the difference between, you know, short-term relief and then longer-term trends like climate change and inequality. Because what we really don't want to see is having the international food trade system worsen income inequality and exacerbate disparities both within and between countries. And I think there are a few points that were made both on unequal market access, or at least having to adapt to changing regulatory environments and the risks that poses in terms of having some producers and farmers who are excluded from global markets or who face unfair competition because of unequal regulatory standards. There was also the point of price volatility and commodity price volatility that was made around having entire countries being over-reliant on food importations and the potential that has for long-term economic and political instability. And then you also have very long-term effects in terms of the environmental consequences of an unequal trade system, such as, you know, as I said earlier, soil depletion through unsustainable agricultural practices, increased land use change, And yes, I mean, effective trade systems can ensure very optimized trade flows and distribution of food, but what food are we talking about? Is it sustainable? Is it healthy and nutritious food? So I think the question of timeframes and competing vulnerabilities that are situated on a sort of longer term timeline is kind of the crux of the issue.
Lucie, you read my mind on a number of elements here. So great segues. I'm actually on the kind of the second part, the kind of the more solutions oriented part. I'm actually going to ask about equitable business practice. You've touched on one. The next question I was going to ask is kind of two parts that I'm going to leave open for people to address. Is, one, what are there elements of the current food trade paradigm that might make the vulnerability worse, especially as with global change, so climate and economic change, but also related to this and related to your comments on kind of equity and environmental issues, Lucie, is a broader question too, is a global food system that's so reliant on a handful of commodity crops setting us up for challenges as we in a changing climate. So these are kind of two questions that feel free to answer. As one is, are there elements of the current food trade paradigm that make us more vulnerable? And quite frankly, somewhat related to this, is a food trade paradigm built around a handful of commodity crops a recipe for disaster in the future? And Ken, I see you are unmuted, so I'm not sure if that means you want to say something or.
I'm ready.
All right, go for it.
Well, that's a key question. And I think some of the work that IFPRI and AgMIP have been doing with trying to model the future are showing that grain price under certain climate scenarios by 2050 alone, grain prices can go up 35%. And the availability of that by traditional exporters can rapidly change. So there's work Greg and I are doing, which is in a year or two we'll be able to share about it. But I see that's what I'm committed to, looking at where are we going so that we can be resilient to that. And look, if we see the future, we can make the necessary changes here, which are across all of the topics my distinguished colleagues on the panel have discussed. It's agronomic, it's management, it's economics, it's politics, it's so many different things in the light of an uncertain future, which makes it even worse. So hoping that activities like COP will give us at least some path, some direction that we're going in dealing with that uncertainty. But as we fumble around, it makes it worse as we have more uncertainty. So these are, I think, the premise of your question is yes. If the vulnerabilities in such a system, and there's something that a group has started called the invisible 60%. And if we're worried about food security, it's those that aren't in the market and don't have access. So how does trade help them? It might even become worse as resources are diverted from them. So I'd love to hear my colleagues' thoughts.
Yeah, great. I will call on the colleagues. Two points. Ken just dropped two acronyms in here. I want to be sure everyone's on the same page. IFPRI is the International Food Policy Research Institute, part of the global network of research centers, part of the CGIAR, which used to stand for something and now just the CGIAR. And AgMIP is the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, and that's a network focused on modeling around agriculture. And one point that Ken touched upon is that food trade can, in one regard, can help mitigate crises, but on the other side of the coin, it can actually help transfer risk throughout a deeply interconnected system. And so that ties into those vulnerabilities. So I want to continue this line of discussion. Cedric, Lydia, Lucie, you want to follow on to what Ken was talking about with the vulnerabilities here, the current paradigm? Cedric, go for it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, it's where shall I start? I mean, I do agree. I mean, basically, this environmental issue and quality of products, as mentioned by Lucie, I think, I mean, are obviously, I mean, very important. I think at the end of the day, I mean, trade has never been completely free and is most likely never going to be free. So what is the purpose is to find the right balance between ensuring trade, but also having the rules and disciplines in terms of governmental actions that go in the right direction. I mean, as of today, we have the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement that ensure that you would have only safe food which is traded. You can think about different things. It's always about a question of balance. So the whole reform process in the WTO has been direction of less trade and production distorting practices. So the question is, what is the right balance? Obviously, some countries need to effectively increase their I mean, all countries need to increase their productivity in a sustainable way. I think we would all agree on that. So the question is, how can the international disciplines, either on subsidies or market access, etc., can support that process while also effectively addressing food security? So basically, I think this is very much a question about how to incentivize the policies that go in that direction, and on the other hand, try to limit the policies that have negative impacts on the other. I mean, food security obviously is very much also a question about my food security versus other members' food security. I mean, quote unquote. I mean, for example, as we know, export restrictions is, I mean, a tool which is, in some instances, absolutely legitimate in order to ensure domestic food security, but at the same time would have an impact on other members. So again, it's a question of balance. And speaking about, I mean, there can be, for an importing country, a risk of trade when you have higher international prices. But on the other hand, if you are a country where you have limited water resources or limited effectively land or etc., I mean, you will need to import one way or the other. And a question about variety of production, yes, indeed, and I fully agree. But I think also it's also through an open market that you would also favor the kind of new crops or new production that would effectively be more adapted to the conditions. And we see today, I mean, especially in Africa, I mean, I think there are kind of, let's say, traditional crops that are again used like cassava, etc., which may be of interest in order to effectively kind of diversify the risk. So again, I think it's a question about you have a network, and the better the network works, I mean, the better it will contribute to the solutions. If you start having the network working less well and less efficiently, then effectively he would be less in a position to kind of contribute to the solution. I hope I made myself clear. Thanks.
No, thank you for that, Cedric. Lydia and Lucie, do you want to reply to this line of discussion?
Maybe just to give my thoughts on the same, I'm just looking at elements of the current food trade system. I'm just thinking, if we continue in the trajectory that we are on, of course, there's going to be the crop failure, the yield reductions, but we're also looking at, we have also shifting agroecological zones. So previously, where we had zones that were high producing, we have seen shifts as the rainfall patterns also shift, like in our country. And over time, also production systems are shifting. So that is also going to now alter. On the issue of the handful of commodities, I think what we are also promoting at country level, looking at also from a nutrition perspective, and this is informed by especially the impact on the drought, is dietary diversity. So across communities, different communities consume different foods. So one of the things that we are encouraging at a national level is that cross-cultural food experience, so that we're able to diversify diets and also enhance nutrition. And this is something that I also believe is one of the things that could really benefit from in the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example. Even as we pick out value chains that are going to be prioritized on that, I think it's important for African countries to also start looking at which value chains also support climate objectives, development objectives, and climate in the sense that a lot of indigenous varieties are also found across African countries. And you find that if we consume cassava in Kenya, it's consumed in Nigeria, it's consumed in Cameroon. So it's very easy to grow that and also learn from them, because our diets are almost similar. Yeah, just my thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. And Lucie, anything you want to contribute? Anything you want to add to this before we move on to the questions and answers?
I agree with the point that was made on less trade that distorts practices. I think that's a very important point. I also agree with the point about needing to have more varied production systems that have as their starting point a country's production capacity in order to increase resilience. I think I also agree with finding the right balance and regulating trade so that it becomes a tool to protect endangered ecosystems. That's typically what's happening with the EU deforestation regulation, with the EUDR now banning the importation of deforestation risky goods onto the single market, and that being a powerful tool that also has pitfalls, such as, the exclusion of producers who don't meet the compliance criteria, and isn't necessarily an adequate tool to clean up all of an importer's supply chains. Only the supply chain that's going to the importing market. But no, I agree with a lot of the points that were made. So thanks.
Great, yeah, thanks. Yeah, and you kind of set the stage for that discussion too, as well. So we're gonna go to the Q&A, and then we're gonna actually pivot and start talking about maybe some of the solutions and connecting to these. Just if you're just joining us, this is the third Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, or FACT Alliance dialogue, co-hosted by MIT's Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab and the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, BOKU. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Immaculate to look at some of the Q&As we've been getting. And just a reminder, please, actually we got a lot rolling in now, so no reminders necessary. Go ahead, Immaculate.
Thank you so much, Greg, Michael, and all panelists. Very interesting conversations. I do have a couple of questions and comments from the audience. So I'll start with Veronica. It's not directed to any specific panelist, so I'll just read out and then any member of the panelist can pick it up. So how do we view regenerative agriculture to sustainable environmental practices and the increase in food productions to accelerate food trade in the region?
So
I take a stand.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Thank you very much, Veronica. So one of the ways in which regenerative agriculture can actually take root is if, for example, in the trade agreement, the AFCFTA, we prioritize value chains that are practicing climate smart agriculture. So by extension, that creates demand for regenerative agricultural practices. But if we just are looking at driving the practices without an end, then it becomes it hangs loosely, and it doesn't achieve the desired result. So if we have a market end that is driving that demand, and of course now this is going to also create this need to create a lot of awareness for consumers that this has been produced in an environment friendly way. So when you look at in Africa, we are now beginning to have a discerning consumer market. But for countries like regions like Europe, the US, these are some of the things that are very, very advanced. And then also the shift in terms of the consumers. So you find that Gen Zs are also very conscious about environmental conservation. So just looking at these dynamics and the trade agreement, and then the growing discerning market, then this can also drive demand. Again, when you look at agriculture, it also is a way of addressing organic waste management at national level or whatever level it is, Well, so as you address organic waste management, you're also able to improve on soil health. So it becomes a win-win across board. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And Lydia, I want to build off of something you said. And Cedric, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And just because you're probably the one who's most engaged in trade agreements on the panel, do you see discussions around trade agreements focusing on equitable business practices, on more ecological focused? Is that part of the discussion going on right now in food trade, or is that, again, I'm putting you on the spot, so I don't want to.
No, I think this is a very valid and important point. I mean, if the agreement on agriculture and the WTO in general, I mean, environmental concerns are part of the objectives and things that members agree to take into account when, I mean, trying to develop trade disciplines that would favor, I mean, more open trade and fair trade, because that's support to, I mean, again, growth, economic growth, etc. But this is very much now entering in the whole SDGs. To respond to your question, and I think this is an issue which now members discuss more openly. 5 years ago, that question would have been not so much discussed in the context of the discussions, but now with food security coming on the agenda, very top of the agenda, relationship with climate change is pretty obvious. Yeah, COP28 is ending at the moment, and our Director General was there, and she made the case, and our DDG also made the case that trade discipline should again address food security and also looking at ways to ensure more environmental sustainable practices. This being said, I mean, this is an issue which is highly debated because, as was just said by Lydia, I mean, the situation of countries are different in nature. So some countries may be more advanced in exploring these kind of approaches, some countries less so. Again, the goal is the same everywhere, to kind of increase productivity in a sustainable manner, but how you do it, and it should not be a pretext for protectionism. So that in some cases you can see, so again, the whole idea is how can we incentivize good practices, but also avoid some approaches that would be a pretext for protectionism. So again, it's a question of balance. So to respond in a nutshell to your question, I think this is a discussion which is starting, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And also, these are issues, and I think Ken made a point, which are extremely complex. I mean, just if you look only at carbon, I mean, climate change, carbon emission is also in itself very complex, despite the fact that you have one carbon, I mean, level all over the world. But when you add biodiversity, when you add water management, etc., situation is very different from one country to the other. So how do you have one agreement addressing all these issues, which are at the same time global and local, is, I think, conceptually a challenge. So not only you have different views because of different situation, but there is definitely a conceptual challenge, which I think is going to take a lot of time some time at least to address. So
all right, thanks, Cedric.
Yeah.
Thank you. Immaculate, let's go back to Immaculate for one more question, and then we'll come back. And then we got about 15 minutes left, so we're gonna accelerate the pace of this, and I'm gonna try to keep everyone in like 60 seconds or less responses. I just realized the time got away from us. So Immaculate, one more question, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Greg. The second question is looking at how can we tackle the waste in the agricultural sector to make gains economically?
Anyone want to take that one?
Okay.
Go for it, Lydia. Yes, please do. And keep it to like 60 seconds if possible.
Yes. And I think I alluded to it when I responded to the other question, that one of the ways we can look at this is developing the organic fertilizer value chain, so that it also now addresses the issues of soil health. Lucie talked about the overuse of fertilizers that is also affecting the soil health. So one of the things that we're also looking at in the country is the remediation of soil health using organic waste, and that has in itself introduced circularity in agriculture, which is now going to give a fighting chance to the different value chains in terms of using sustainable, safe inputs, and also creating opportunity for many others. And especially like in our country context, we are looking at an inclusive approach where it creates opportunity for women and youth oriented cooperatives in management of waste. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Let me come in here. Immaculate, we'll have a second round after this session, and I'd like to go back to conflicts just for a few minutes. And Cedric, you may say, no, we're taking care of this. The head of state coming together, and we're all good. But in light of rising geopolitical tensions that we obviously observe every day, how can countries avoid using food as a tool for political leverage? I mean, are we sufficiently prepared for this, or do we need, like we have done in the environment, do we need for conflict mitigation also a new code of conduct, a new compliance criteria? Yeah, would that be part of the contribution to make food systems and trade more resilient? Again, open question to Cedric.
Yeah, well, that is probably a difficult question. I mean, obviously, the geopolitical situation has implication on the WTO as it has on any other organizations and international discussions. What I would say for sure is that by definition, the WTO disciplines are aimed at avoiding this kind of situation. I mean, the MFN principle and all the principles are precisely aiming at avoiding this kind of situation. And I think in the recent, again, month, and as a matter of fact, all members, I think, are keen to ensure, to avoid that there are some kind of impact on trade flows that would impact food security. But different members may have different views on how that translates. I mean, I'm afraid I can't say far more than that. But again, conviction is that if the system works well and all the members agree, that is precisely the kind of problem or risk that we should try to avoid to the extent possible.
Right. Anyone else who wants to come in on that particular point? No, I don't see anyone. Then let's move on. And one basis for sound decisions at national, regional, and global level is data, right? And there's a lot of data on trade out there. Yet, do we have sufficient data on actually what makes us vulnerable as members in the food system, or does there's Greg and Ken and others working on the vulnerability index? What contribution can that one make? And I would even go further and ask, what can AI and machine learning contribute in future to get prepared, for what we can't imagine at the moment? Greg, that's the opening for the next round.
On this, because I on the data point, Ken, we're going to come to you on that. Actually, I can come to you now because you've been living and breathing this with me and the rest of the team. So please, speak to that question that Michael was asking.
There is very good data on the main traded crops that go on in a bilateral sense. What we have and what we're attempting to do in the Jamil Index is to look at the vulnerability of trade in the future. And so the problem is modeling what I call the social science and the financial behavior of trade. Why does one country import from 3 very geographically dispersed suppliers and others have 10 from local regions? What are the things that drive the contracts that are made? Are people looking at risk reduction? Is it a portfolio approach where they look at the variability of yields in a country? Is it a geopolitical thing where there's friendliness between the countries, which trade delegations go and they make long-term things? That whole side, what we do know, it's not cost. So there's a world market price and there's a shipping price. And these do not describe very well in any kind of econometric or statistical way what countries do. So trying to understand that behavior of trade is really important to understand when we change things, how will that change? And that's what we're trying to do. We have a bunch of great people at Oxford and at the International Food Policy Research Institute in University of Cape Town, trying to understand those in a better way. But right now, we can only see it as a scenario. We don't, it's an unknown. We don't know how those are happening and why. And that's maybe where some AI or some other things might be able to tease out those practices, because everything's so dynamic. Every year is never the same. So I think the more data, the better, but Comtrade and FAO have done a great job at the national level of understanding that. So we can model it, we can plot it, but we can't predict why it's doing it yet. And that's what we're hoping to do to help us make better policies and know what to change.
Thanks, Ken. Lydia, I saw you nod. I don't want to read too much into a nod, but if there's anything you wanted to follow up on that, I want to give you a chance to do so. And if this was a nod, then let me know and we can move on. Okay, all right. Anyone else want to touch on Michael's question? Okay, so I just want to, we've talked a little bit, just real quick. I just want to be sure people have the link to the Jamil Index. We've talked a bit about it. It's a bit of a plug here, but we're going to be launching the actual website and the core index early in the new year. If people want to learn more, Immaculate, if you can drop the link to it in the chat so the panelists have it. It's just kind of the initial background on it, but I figured folks might be interested in that.
Maybe
Lydia, you just went unmuted, so I want to give you a chance to.
Thank you. It just crossed my mind, and I really appreciate what Ken was presenting. One of the other challenges is that the availability of capacities to leverage emerging technologies for this kind of information. So you find that, well, that is resident, maybe, for example, in with MIT. Those are some of the capacities that we're also looking at to leverage. How do we leverage analytics in terms of informing trade, even trade negotiations? How do we do that? And also, while doing that, while leveraging on emerging technologies, also provide opportunity for young people. So there is need to also address that so that it doesn't result in deepening the digital divide. So if that is one of the things that an area of investment, especially for a lot of developing countries going forward. Yeah.
Thank you. And kind of building off of some of the things we've talked about, equity, we've talked about sustainability, and this is all very business related, ultimately. So Lucie, you work for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. This seems like your bread and butter. I want to pose a question to you in terms of getting your view on kind of how we can encourage more equitable and sustainable business practices in the food sector, especially as it relates to food trade. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah. So what we're asking the six agribusinesses that make up the Soft Commodities Forum, so ADM, Bunge, Cargill, COFCO International, Dreyfus, and Viterra, is to be able to source commodities through very strong and robust traceability schemes for both direct and indirect sourcing, and to be able to prove that their sourcing is devoid of any risk of deforestation and native vegetation conversion. And going back to the question of data access, which is really key, because you can't know whether your supply chains are clean without having access to geospatial imagery that confirms that your sourcing profile is not risky. And that's where I spoke about the EU deforestation regulation earlier, which is a really key regulatory development for these companies that are the first importers onto the European market, and that are going to have to prove that they're either able to trace, and confirm DCF compliance with this new standard, or not import and lose market access to that importing market. So the role that the EU as a trading bloc can play in providing the traceability tools and the geospatial imagery tools to smaller players that may not have access to what remain expensive technologies is an important aspect to how we avoid the emergence of a two-tier market, right? Where you have, segregated raw materials that are compliant, that are entering the EU, and then a number of smallholder farmers that may not be able to confirm compliance, but therefore would be excluded from that market. And so that two-tier dynamic is very much a risk. Yeah, I'll stop there, but I'm happy to share any other thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks. No, I was thank you for that perspective. It's I've been, that's been on my list of ones to ask you from the start. We only have about 3 minutes left, so I want to touch on one question related to infrastructure, and then I actually want to go to the Q&A. There was a question specifically to Cedric, but one thing that Ken and I talk a lot about is, increasing climate vulnerability. What type of kind of infrastructure investments do we need to be making, because they take time to implement. So as it relates to trade and infrastructure, what are some vulnerabilities? What type of planning do we need to do? What can help in planning for that? Ken, I'm going to go right to you on this just because we talk about this a lot. So I want to give you a chance to touch on it. And if anyone wants to respond, they can. And you're muted.
There's 3 levels that we want to deal with infrastructure, and even currently is most food is shipped over the maritime. So there is the bottleneck of new exporters in getting materials to the ports and then get them loaded on ships. But then the other side is the unloading. As they get there, how do they get off at the port? So that's huge. But one of the big things is the intercontinental road network that needs to do trade. And one of the things that has to be addressed is there are countries that are transshippers. So for example, Zimbabwe is really important to get food from Central Africa to Southern Africa and moving around. How do we fund them? Because they are the bottleneck on the trade. How do we build the roads there so that things can travel, or rail? How do those countries that aren't a producer or demander, but are key to that? So that's something that has to be discussed. Maybe that's something for WTO. We give more to Cedric to do. But this whole issue and working in Africa, we know with NAPAD and the African Union we're helping them to make climate resilient infrastructure. But one of the key things is countries that are throughputs, how do they get the funds they need to serve the countries, the other citizens that aren't in their country? So that's a really important issue. It's the same thing happens in the electric grid, those who carry the electricity but not using it there. How do we help them? So that's a key issue. And as climate changes, those will be dynamic, but there's a huge need for that right now.
Thanks, Ken. Any 30-second responses to what Ken said? All right. Oh, Lydia, go ahead.
Yes, so mine would be on institutional framework, and not on the side of government, but now on the non-state actors, specifically the private sector. So one of the things in Kenya for the agriculture sector we are doing is the multi-stakeholder platform, where we have cascaded the model to the subnational level, which is the counties. And now these are becoming avenues to build capacity on trade avenues that could take climate smart agriculture goods, and also building capacity to access climate finance, because we are looking at that as one of the main avenues to address both climate, trade, and development objectives at a country level. Yeah, so something that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And Cedric, there was a question to you. I'm just going to kind of throw this out there for people to think about. If you got a quick 10-second response, we'll do it. But basically, the question was, what's your opinion on the feasibility of promoting on a global scale kind of local forgotten crops? So products like cassava leaves and some of the more locally oriented crops that might be more climate adapted. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of promoting kind of more local forgotten crops into the global food trade system, Cedric, or?
Well, yeah, no, my only point is that, I mean, if you have an international system that effectively, I mean, integrates the different costs, including, I mean, cost, environmental costs, externalities, etc., that should come. I think we're in a period where effectively countries are trying to see, etc. And my belief is that that will effectively, in itself, you do not have. I mean, if you have a system which is fair and reasonably open, that will effectively favor this kind of development. And including by, I think Africa also finding also possible new export directions for some products which are initially local, but can also, and we see some of these kind of things where you can use in other countries. So yeah, that would be my second response, but happy to.
Thanks, Cedric. Thank you for getting that in. And Ken made a comment that interregional trade is key. And I actually think this is a good place to kind of leave. This is actually one of the, I would say one of the positive sides on the horizon that we're seeing is a growing recognition of the vulnerabilities in our food trade system and an increasing openness and desire to explore a variety of options that potentially build greater resilience and greater equity and greater sustainability into the system. Cedric, you said that there's an increase, that there is an increasing openness to some of these forgotten crops. And Ken, you talked about the importance of regional trade. This gives us some hope. I want to leave on that positive note. Michael, I'm going to hand it back to you for anything you want to close with. And I just want to thank everyone for joining and for the panelists. Michael, go ahead. Anything you want to add?
The question was also who has the primary responsibility for taking action. And I think Lydia, in her statement, made it very clear. Paraphrasing Lydia, it's all of us as part of the platforms that we arrange and orchestrate. And in that spirit, I want to thank everyone: Cedric, Ken, Lydia, Lucie, and Immaculate in the back end moderating. Immaculate, if you can come to the fore again, please. And all the many questions that you asked, we unfortunately couldn't address all of them. Paul Lisana, apologies for that. It was a great conversation. The next one will be in January, and then we're gonna talk about resource conflicts with a great panel. So,
yep. So it'll be, the next one will be, is that January? Do we have the date on that?
16th.
January 16th, and then we have a final one on January 30th. 23rd. Focused on what?
23rd. It's okay.
Oh, sorry, 23rd. My apologies. Focused on fixing the fixes that have failed. So thank you all. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, panelists, for helping make this a really dynamic conversation that just made the hour go by like that. Till next time, everybody.